to have taken time out today and deliver this very enlightening, very learned lecture to all of us who are mostly comprising of what I would call the millennial or the Gen Z generation, which has only heard or read about the emergency in bits and pieces, but were fortunate enough to have not lived through those very terrorsome years. The most important aspect of his lecture was not just the focus on what abuse was inflicted upon the Constitution during the emergency, but how, in a very seemingly safe manner, in a very seemingly unsuspicious manner, the pitch was kept ready for the imposition of the emergency at a future date by previous governments. So starting from the very first amendment of the Constitution to the 42nd amendment that later followed during the emergency periods, we see a very clear streak of how attempts were made to curtail the fundamental rights of citizens. And this was done in more than a few instances in the garb of protecting or furthering the very citizens whose interests they wanted to protect. So, in other words, the Constitution was subverted using the garb of constitutionalism. It was truly an enlightening speech, and all of us, as students of the law, and most importantly as young citizens, on whose shoulders rests the responsibility of protecting these very precious freedoms, I would want to thank Shri Tushar Mehta ji for this very scintillating, very educating lecture. Thank you so much on behalf of all of us. We have covered much ground today in terms of the legal aspects and the constitutional aspects, the judicial aspects that the learned Solicitor General has touched upon. And I wouldn't hazard to venture to address similar areas in the presence of such an eminent stalwart. However, as a political activist, and most importantly as a member of a political party, which has the distinction of having been at the forefront of protecting the constitutional freedoms, as a member of a political party whose founding fathers, whose founding members of the party were jailed for 13, 14 months, suffered innumerable pains to protect the Constitution, to protect the democracy, and to keep it alive and thriving, as somebody who carries forward this political legacy, I think it is important for me and important for all of us to also reflect upon a few political dimensions of this abuse, so that we may remain vigilant in today's times or in times in the future, so that such a abuse does not ever get repeated. A question came by a member of the audience on the index with respect to our freedom of expression, freedom of the press, our quality of democracy. Friends, just a few days ago, when our Prime Minister was in the United States, while addressing the historic address to the joint session of the United States Congress, the Prime Minister very proudly stated the fact that India is a very robust democracy where there are more than 2,500 registered political parties competing with each other, and there are more than 23 political parties which are in power in different states of the country. Contrast this to what a now disqualified MP from the opposition stated when he was in foreign soil, and even made a plea to foreign agencies, foreign powers, to interfere in India's domestic affairs, again in the garb of protecting democracy in India. Contrast these two approaches. And even while the Prime Minister was abroad in the United States, hailing the very robust and albeit chaotic democracy in a very proud fashion, there was again these very vested interest lobbies which were posing questions to him on these very issues, unmindful of the fact that even while the Prime Minister was in the United States, here in Patna, every single opposition political party had come together in open media attention in robust political political activism was taking place right here in Patna, where political parties from the opposition were making an effort to build a coalition against the Prime Minister. What can there be a bigger example of a robust functioning democracy in India? Therefore, the point that was made, or rather highlighted in the earlier part of the speech, that many a times attempts are made to subvert the constitution in the garb of constitutionalism. In the same way, freedom of expression is curtailed by those very people who claim to be champions of freedom of expression, is something that this generation and as a learned audience we must all be aware of. The other distinction that we must be rather appreciating today is when the Prime Minister made this very important mention that India has 2,500 registered political parties in the country, and that is a sign of how strong the country's democracy is. We must also remember that the Congress Party's official publication, the National Herald, during the time of emergency, had in print commented that the time had come in India to evolve into a single party democracy. Contrast these two positions again, of those people who claim to be the self-appointed guardians of democracy, and who on every occasion vilify the Prime Minister as autocratic, as dictatorial, as majoritarian. These are the very people whose legacy is this, that they imposed the emergency on the country, suspended fundamental rights, suspended the constitution in operation, and the official position of the party's political publication was that the time had come in India to move towards a single party democracy. That's something that all of us, I stress this again and again because we were not alive during the period when the emergency was imposed, but it is important for us to be aware of those mistakes so that such a proposition cannot be even made tomorrow. The other important, as I was listening to Tusharji's lecture, the frontal attack on the judiciary that he mentioned is also very intrinsic of a particular mindset that a particular family is over and above the law and the constitution and the institutions of this nation. Because the whole of the emergency, the question came as to what was the what were the triggers, what was the reasons for the imposition of the emergency. And if I am not wrong, there was already an external emergency that was proclaimed and was already in existence when the internal disturbance justification was made, and this emergency was again imposed. So the essential reason was to perpetuate the rule of a particular family and a particular political party. And that family and that party wanted, or rather believed, that they were above the constitution of this country. Which is why something that is absolutely unimaginable today was done. That is to perpetuate, or rather extend the term of the Lok Sabha, the parliament, by 2 years. Can you believe this? That for a whole 2 years, the proposal was that the term of the Lok Sabha must be extended by 2 years, and the elections were not held for 1 full year. And these are the people who today call the Prime Minister as majoritarian and authoritative. This again also is an indication of the mindset that this particular family, this particular leadership still continues to feel that the democratic and constitutional institutions in India must be subservient to their cause. Which is why if an election is lost, the EVM is blamed. If an election is lost, the credibility of the Election Commission of India is questioned. If a particular judgment does not come in the favor or in the likeness of the particular family, then again the very credibility and the independence of the judiciary is questioned. This again shows that these are the residual factors, these are the residues of the very same mentality that existed a few decades ago, which imposed emergency in the country. I would only want to leave all of you by reading a very insightful paragraph from an article that one of the tallest leaders of this country, Shri Arun Jaitley ji, had written. After emergency, he was at the very forefront of the fight against emergency, was jailed here for 13, 14 months. And this is a very interesting article that Shri Jaitley writes, commenting on what may have inspired the imposition of emergency. I would like to read just 2 paragraphs so that we are aware of the machinations, the apparently very sincere, apparently very harmless actions that these vested interests took and are capable of taking in the future also. He writes, was this script inspired by what happened in Nazi Germany in 1933? Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany on 30th January 1933. He did not have an absolute majority in Parliament. On 20th February, he got his president to invoke Article 48 of the Constitution, which gave emergency powers for the protection of the people in the state. The decree giving emergency powers put restrictions on personal liberty, free speech, right of assembly, association, violation of privacy, home searches, and promoted restrictions on private property and all other fundamental rights. It's just so similar to what we heard happened during the emergency here. The pretext of the imposition of the emergency in Germany was that on February 27th, German parliament house known as Reichstag had been set on fire. Hitler claimed that it was a communist conspiracy to burn government buildings and museums. 13 years later, in the Nuremberg trials, it was established that the fire was the handiwork of the Nazis themselves and that Goebbels had conceived it. Hitler continued to maintain that his actions were within the four corners of the constitution. Mrs. Gandhi imposed the emergency under 352, suspended fundamental rights under 359, claimed that disorder was planned by the opposition in the country. The security forces were being asked to disobey illegal orders, and therefore, in the larger interest of the nation, India had to become, quote-unquote, disciplined democracy. Both Hitler and Mrs. Gandhi never abrogated the constitution. They used the republican constitution to transform democracy into dictatorship. I would like to read that line again. They used a republican constitution to transform democracy into dictatorship. Hitler arrested most of the opposition members of parliament and therefore converted his minority government in parliament into a government which had two-thirds majority present and voting. Mrs. Gandhi arrested most opposition members of parliament and therefore procured through their absence a two-thirds majority of members present and voting. The 42nd Amendment diluted the power of high courts to issue writ petitions, a power which Dr. Ambedkar has said was the very heart and soul of India's constitution. They also amended Article 368, which was mentioned, so that a constitution amendment was beyond judicial review. This was, he says, a frontal attack on the very soul of the constitution. But there were a few things that Hitler did not do, which Mrs. Gandhi did. She prohibited the publication of parliamentary proceeding in India, in media. Well, this answers your question. She prohibited the publication of parliamentary proceeding in the media. The law which gave mandate to the media for publishing parliamentary proceedings, known as the Feroz Gandhi Bill, because late Shri Feroz Gandhi had singularly campaigned for her after the Haridas Mundra scandal, which was raised by him in parliament. Since Hitler's own election had been set aside, he had no change to make in this regard. Mrs. Gandhi amended both the Constitution and the Representation of People Act to protect her own election. The point was mentioned by Tusharji of how a prospective, not yet passed legislation was made as the basis to protect her election. In the end, this is what he says and concludes. The most objectionable change was to extend the life of Parliament by 2 years. The Indian Lok Sabha is elected under the Constitution for a maximum period of 5 years. It is the guarantee of a limited jurisdiction by the sovereign, the people. It cannot perpetuate its existence, but it was done. In fact, from 1971 to 1977, the Lok Sabha lasted for 6 full years. This amendment was only reversed subsequently by the Janta government. So, all of these very clearly indicate of how the pitch was ready, the field was kept ready, so that if there would be any threat to the political power of this particular family, in the garb of protecting the fundamental rights, in the garb of furthering the objectives of the directive principles of the Constitution, measures could be taken to suspend the very Constitution that they claim to protect. And I would only like to leave all of you with this thought, dear friends. Whether it was the lessons that led to the partition of the country, or whether the important historical lessons that led to the imposition of emergency and the abuse on the Constitution that later followed, it is important for us, especially, like I said, the millennial generation, the Gen Z generation, which has not physically witnessed the terrorsome years of those decades, to be vigilant, to be aware, so that a similar hazard, a similar attempt is not made in the future. I think this was the core objective of organizing this program, and I'm sure that with Tusharji's lecture, this very important wake-up call, this very important message has been hammered and been delivered to all of us, in the hope that we will all remain vigilant, in the hope that we will recognize the fact that dynasty and democracy do not go together, and with the very important responsibility that it is on all of our shoulders to protect the fundamental freedoms that the Constitution has provided us. I thank all of you for being a wonderful audience on a Sunday evening, a rainy evening in Sunday. And I want to mention my very special regards and congratulations to the organizer of this program, the convener of the Young Lawyers Forum in Delhi, Shri Visu Basoyaji, and his entire team for having put together such a wonderful show. Congratulations, Vishu, and thank you all for coming here and making this program a wonderful success. Thank you so much. Namaste.